Hello everyone. Welcome to this lecture on news and conflict. This lecture is part of your paper on news and society. This module explores the linkages between news and conflict in two ways. Firstly, conflict as the basic nature of news, and secondly, conflict as constructed and represented by the news for the audiences. News as a genre of media is seen here as representations manifested in the form of constructed narratives. The idea is to situate conflict in journalism as a practice and also explore the diverse representations of conflict in the constructed news narratives. Conflict is endemic to human society. The Twin Tower attacks in the US, the London train bombings, the Mumbai attacks, the gruesome Paris attacks, the Manchester attacks, and the latest June terror attacks in London clearly shows that the international community is struggling hard to find ways to fight terrorism. These attacks are a grim reminder that extremism and fundamentalism have gripped a certain section of the society and their ideas are in conflict with the rest of the world. While the threat of the global terrorism looms large, other types of conflicts around religion, race, gender, class, caste continue to persist internally across cultures and societies. Simultaneously, the industrial advancements are in conflict with the environmental threats, protests, and movements across nation proper. So it's so frequent where individuals are constantly in disagreement with each other or with the state over social, cultural, political, or economic issues. Thus, we see that conflict is one of the many traits of any individual which continuously creates situations that stimulates the society to generate several responses like fear, threat, anger, pain, happiness, and agony. It needs to be underlined here that this conflict-laden society has been and is living in a mediated world. To simplify conflict is communicated to each other through diverse media platforms like the print, television, online, mobile or news media applications. In the words of Simon Cottle, we live in times of mediatized conflict. News is a crucial genre of media where journalists perceptibly have acquired largely a conflict-oriented approach to the world. News narratives constructed pay little or no attention to conflict resolution. News stories represented in media therefore explore the causes and nature of conflict in its various cultural contexts. Learning outcome. The module will help develop an understanding of the diverse linkages between the new genre of media and conflict as a concept. It will also help in understanding the complexities of representations in news media and the structure and form of news narratives focused on conflict. Situating conflict in news. Conflict as a concept is very broad in nature. There is a consensus among scholars over the problem of defining conflict. Studies in media and culture clearly point out that conflict as a term can be best defined as a situation where one or more individuals or parties have disagreement over an idea or an issue which may or may not acquire violent forms. There has been a broad consensus that conflict covers a wide range of themes like international or ethnic confrontations, minority groups and confrontations among political parties and candidates. The word conflict is used interchangeably with synonyms like dispute, discord, strife, contest, contention, clash, controversy, fight, battle, brawl, and war. In daily life, front page of a newspaper in India, on an average, headlines nearly 10 to 11 news stories, which are largely focused on terror attacks, armed conflicts, border disputes, refugee crisis, environmental discords, contest among political parties, rapes, riots, murders, loot, and controversies around celebs, especially from films or sports. Television news, since it is an audio-visual medium, is a little more over the top in locating newsworthiness in different types of conflict. News as conflict seems to be at the core of the journalistic practice. Contestations of everyday life are constantly selected, constructed and represented for the audience through a variety of news narratives. The focus of news is mainly to explore the sides of social and political conflict or contest, which may be at three levels: local, national or international. Studies show that conflict, it seems, is the very mode through which journalists usually understand and interpret the society. What is to be covered or what news is worthy? The answer in almost every newsroom lies in discerning the process of the selectivity of the issues chosen. Studies shows that a crucial factor that makes an issue worthy to be reported is the potential within it to create and sustain conflict in the minds of the audience. Studies show that the human beings have an increased stimulus to negative stories as compared to the positive ones. The news media sphere also seems to be structured and restructured around these responses of the audiences. The idea, perhaps, that the audience or the media market have an ever-increasing appetite for stories that create fear, pain, anger, threat, sorrow, etc. Journalism as a practice therefore seems to have a conflict-oriented approach towards looking at the world. In the words of renowned communication scholar Gady Walsfield, a peace process takes time to unfold and develop. Journalistic demand immediate result. Most of a peace process is marked by dull, tedious negotiations. Journalists require drama. A successful peace process leads to a reduction in tensions. Journalists focus on conflicts. Many of the significant developments within a peace process must take place in secret behind closed doors. Journalists demand information and action. It needs to be underlined here that journalism as a profession in 21st century chooses to value only conflict as news and ignores the resolution of it. Studies show that the reasons behind this could be numerous. Psychologists believe that conflict is one of the basic traits of human beings, and journalists exploit this basic trait as a property of increased audience reception. Social scientists also believe that conflict in news is seen by media organization as a cultural commodity. American sociologist Herbert G. Jens pointed out that journalists value conflict because of its commercial value. Several scholars supporting the economic viewpoint believe that conflict sells and that if it bleeds, it leads. It needs to be underlined here that news organizations recognize conflict quickly and easily than any other forms of social change or development. Journalists, it seems, believe that the audience enjoys watching out of curiosity and inquisitiveness stories of contest and conflict, which may or may not lead to violence in crude form. Stories of full-scale war, terror attacks or insurgency, print or audiovisual, whatever, are a rarity for an ordinary human being. Hence, the interest is retained naturally in such media text. However, stories of contestations of everyday life like the family feuds, banal celebrity clashes, politicians hurling abuses at each other, wardrobe malfunction, fulfill news organizations' commercial interest. Hence, such conflicts are retained to be repeatedly shown to the audiences, especially on television. Making more profit in the competitive news media market in the 21st century is a crucial factor in deciding the newsworthiness of conflict as a cultural commodity. Conflict as news. As storytellers, journalists constantly seek and exploit narrative tensions. News narratives are representations of a constructed reality, which is selected by the producers for the audience consumption. While representing conflict, journalists strive hard to be seen as neutral and objective news observers, merely reporting on a particular issue. Truth and reality are the two elements that journalists strive for. However, it is paradoxical that philosophy's main concern till date revolves around understanding the meanings of truth and reality. So while the former constructs the representations of the reality, the latter tries to deconstruct the meanings of those constructed representations. To understand the linkages between news and conflict, it is crucial, therefore, to discern the content and form of the narrative about conflict produced. Journalism, therefore, remains the principal convener and conveyor of conflict images and information, discourses and debates. Cultural context of conflict as news. As discussed earlier, journalism follows a process of selecting news items based on factors that make them newsworthy. Conflict is one such factor which is a crucial yardstick for newsworthiness. However, the chronology of the top-down order of the rundown in a newsroom is defined by the socio-cultural context of the prevailing situation in a particular place. Take for example that the day of parliamentary election results in India is a crucial newsworthy day for a newsroom in India. Almost everyone is in a state of conflict, like the voter, the contestants, the ruling party, the opposition, the markets, the traders, and businessman, so on and so forth. While any story, big or small, related to the national elections is covered in news, what happens? Suppose there is a terror attack in London. International newspapers and television news channels may headline it as the top story in the genre of conflict, but for India, the national election contest will remain the top story, while the London attack story may slip down the rundown. This is to say that conflict as news in this case is represented for the audience in a cultural context at a certain time and place. Conflict as a commodity. News organizations are aware of the local, national and international cultural context of the journalistic practices. Conflict sells, but before constructing news stories on it or about it or related to it, the journalists or the editors keep in mind the nature of audience which is supposed to be consuming it. For instance, the Nirbhaya rape case. It's a story, or an Arushi Talwar murder case. Story may be of immense social relevance for the Indian audiences, but for the audience outside the country, it may be just another story representing social conflict. Similarly, for the mainstream newspapers and television news channels in India, the story of the surgical strikes by the Indian Army inside the Pakistani territory may be hugely significant across newsrooms, but for the foreign press, it might just pass off, not even as a ticker in television channels or newspaper like the BBC, CNN or the Washington Post or a New York Times. However, it needs to be underlined here that for the news organizations in India, these very same stories would have been immensely profitable to hold the audience attention and consequently in making huge profits. In pursuit of securing more television rating points or TRPs in common, the journalistic ethics went for a toss in the Arushi Talwar murder case. No doubt, the story of a young teenager murder was newsworthy story for the people to know, but the unprofessional manner in which sections of the press covered it led to destruction of evidence on the crime scene. Within hours of the crime committed, television news cameras were inside the house, the site of the murder. The irresponsible behavior of the press could have been avoided. Result was the initial investigations were totally botched up and the murder case unfortunately witnessed extensive delays. News reporting, especially the television news, provided a hysterical over-the-top coverage, and the later came under severe attack from within the media community itself. Constructive and destructive aspects. Now, news narratives as represented in diverse media platforms have immense potential to impact the conflict itself. Thus, conflict represented as a news narrative can have both constructive and destructive impact. A news narrative may impact the communication between two parties, or communication aimed at facilitating a conflict situation may backfire. Representations of the Mumbai terror attack of 2008 are an interesting case study as far as the television news coverage of the incident is concerned. When the news of the shooting in the city of Mumbai came around, all sections of the society, including the government, the security forces and the journalists, were taken by surprises. Television news channels for several hours had no clue about the 5 Ws and 1 H. 5 Ws means what, when, where, why, which, and 1 H means how of the news. It took several hours until the government confirmed to the journalists that it was a terror attack that held the city of Mumbai hostage. The constructive aspect of the news coverage was that the channels were being used to disseminate information to the public at large to stay indoors. Numbers of the police and government helplines could be flashed on a screen, as it was an unusual calamity for the nation where the priority was to minimize the continued loss to life in the city. However, there were numerous destructive aspects of the news coverage of the Mumbai terror attacks. The television news cameras, Indian and foreign both, were put up live at the ongoing rescue operations at the contested sites in Mumbai, like the Taj Mahal Hotel, the Oberoi Hotel, the Chhatrapati Shivaji Railway Station, the Kama Hospital and the Leopold Cafe. Reports suggest that allegedly the handlers of the Mumbai attacks sitting in Pakistan could improvise and monitor their actions even while the Indian security forces battled the terrorists in the city. The images of the two Pakistani terrorists, Ismail and Ajmal Kasab, with guns in their hands, were flashed by sections of television and print news media, which reassured their handlers back home that the attacks were executed. Ajmal Amir Kasab was the only terrorist who was captured alive in the Mumbai attack case and later hanged. Clearly, over-the-top news reporting of the ongoing terror attacks by sections of the press was mainly destructive in nature, as it posed a serious threat to the country's national security. So, negative stereotypes and inadequate representation of minority. News organizations are often criticized for inadequately representing the minority communities. As mentioned above, since the news narratives have a conflict-oriented approach towards issues of women, Dalits, Muslim and Christians, the Indian press mostly ends up perpetuating a negative stereotype of the minority community. It is not routine for the journalist to report on the status of illiteracy or unemployment among women, crimes against them like rape and domestic violence, etc., unless there is an incident. Studies show that women issues are largely underrepresented in the mainstream news media. Take for example the issue of triple talaq. Journalists hardly reported on the negatives and positives of this issue of a Muslim marriage. It was on the October 16, 2015 that the Supreme Court questioned whether the Muslim personal law practices of marriage and divorce reduce women to mere chattels. Following this observation by the court, the Indian press jumped on covering this issue. Another problem or challenge associated in the news representation of the minorities, perhaps, is perpetuation of negative stereotypes. Among others, the most visible negative representation in news is that of a Muslim stereotype. Muslim men are no monoliths. The community is heterogeneous and there is no denying that the growing extremist or the fundamentalist aspect of Islam among sections of Muslim is a serious concern. However, the news representations of the Muslims increases during a Hindu-Muslim riot or during a terror attack by the Islamic fundamentalist. However, the stories of the life and culture of the Muslim community living in peace is generally missing in daily journalistic practices. The result is that the Muslim perhaps is mostly perceived as the other, having a violent streak either as a rioter or as a terrorist. Debates and discussions in news on women mostly revolve around the crime against women, representing them as the stereotypical weaker sex in society, like hiding their names as rape victims and even faces at times when they choose to speak up on camera. Similarly, Dalit issues are fined or some media coverage in case of a violent conflict or crime situation. In routine journalistic practices, stories of opportunities and challenges for a Dalit in Indian society is sidelined, even labeled in newsrooms as boring. Conflict is endemic to human society. Journalism as a practice focuses on representing conflict of various types in news narratives. Conflict in the news genre operates in two ways. Conflict as a basic nature of news and representations of conflict as news in a variety of ways. While representing conflict, journalists strive hard to be seen as neutral and objective news observers, merely reporting on a particular issue. News stories represent conflict for the audience in a cultural context as a commodity driven by the pressure of market forces with an aim to maximize profit. In the process of representing conflict as news, narratives have the potential to generate constructive and destructive impact on the minds of the audiences. Further, the content disseminated in the form of news faces criticism for reinforcing negative stereotypes and inadequate representations, especially in the cases of the marginalized communities in the society. Thank you.